Hello, my name is Connor. Today I would like to talk to you about National Socialism, a subject which I don't really want to say is dear to my heart, only that I have a history with this particular ideology. I consider myself to be an ex-Nazi, although I didn't identify as a Nazi at any point really. It's more just that having sort of moved on from a particular set of ideas, I've since felt that it makes sense to use this term for how I used to think and how a certain amount of people around the world do think. This is a result of my own personal experience and my own research into the subject. So, different people might have slightly different ideas about what National Socialism is, but I'm going to give you my definition of it, which I think it more or less just boils down to racial xenophobia. So it's the idea that people who are more genetically distant to yourself do not have a shared interest with you, and they're kind of inherently a threat to your own group, as it were. The idea in principle is that shared blood is equivalent to shared interest. That's the fundamental assumption, I believe, of National Socialism. And you can find this type of thinking among people who they don't call themselves National Socialists. They might actually even dislike how it was applied in practice in Germany in the 1930s and 40s. But as far as I'm concerned, such people still count as Nazis because, again, as far as I can tell from a historical perspective, when these kind of ideas are applied to a political system, you get, the Third Reich, that kind of thing. So it's been tried, and that was the result, basically. And yeah, I think you would get something similar if people that think like this were actually to achieve political power again. But without further ado, let's get into a bit more detail, because that's a bit more interesting than just saying this is what I think this is and just leave it at that. So the actual term National Socialism did come about in the 19th century, but somewhat separate from the ideas, like this sort of racial xenophobia thing. The term National Socialism actually started off more as associated with like left-wing movements, so more like left-wing nationalism, so particularly that of the Poles and the Czechs, because they were living under the rule of other people. Poland was split between Austria, Germany, and Russia, and the Czechs were living under Austrian rule. So they wanted their own nation states, because that, of course, was a feature of the 19th century, was nationalism. So you had the three kind of ideologies: liberalism, which is basically the same as capitalism. It's capitalism's more specifically the economics. Liberalism is more like the economic and social aspect. You had nationalism, which tied together with liberalism in the sense that liberals at that time, they kind of saw things in the framework of the nation state. So as opposed to, let's say, an empire, which has like a ruling elite and they rule over multiple different groups of people, liberals at that time preferred the idea of, everybody within the nation state. They all basically have the same fundamental rights. There isn't somebody who has a set of rights and somebody else doesn't, kind of thing. That's how it's supposed to work. And then you have socialism, which that was kind of a response to, I suppose, the problems created by the economic system that we call capitalism, associated with liberalism. Point being that, there was something of an issue, and this is more getting into the ideas that I am describing as National Socialism. So moving away from this, people like the Czechs and Poles that wanted their own nation states, and they were tended to be sympathetic to socialism, and more into what we would probably understand more as National Socialism, which more ties into this racial xenophobia kind of thing. And there were a lot of men in the 19th century, particularly of German ethnicity, that were thinking along these lines, But the earliest I could find that actually used the term National Socialism to apply to these kind of ideas was a man called Friedrich Lange, writing in the 1890s. And his ideas were a mixture of anti-Semitism, anti-capitalism, and also anti-socialism and anti-Catholicism. So very much emphasizing, I suppose, a Protestant German kind of perspective, and very much that to the exclusion of anything else you could be, I suppose, in that place in that time. So the problem, basically, the kind of people that thought like this were coming up against was that the principle of liberalism is that everybody living within a nation state basically has the same fundamental rights. We're all part of the same nation. The problem, though, came with how to define the nation. Now, liberals would define it more as living within the same territory or just living within the same nation state. So it's like, yeah, you might have multiple ethnicities. The country may be named after the dominant ethnicity. So let's say Germany is named after the Germans, a specific ethnic group. But there might be other people living there, but they should have rights as well because they live in the same space, basically. So, and this is what happened is in Germany, it wasn't one country to start with. It was actually lots of different German states. But in quite a lot of these, the Jews in particular were given the same rights as the Germans because that was the liberal principle. But there were a certain amount of Germans that didn't feel this made sense because their definition of the nation was racial. So they felt, well, how can you do that? Because the Jews are quite clearly a different people. They are not genetically related to us, which, ironically enough, we now know that is definitely the case. Jews and Germans do not overlap genetically much at all. They're quite distinct from each other. Germans obviously just being typical for, Northern Europe. And the Jews they cluster more with just Mediterranean people, even if they live in Northern Europe. So they are genetically distinct. And so from the perspective of these early Nazis, basically, they thought, no, it doesn't make sense to consider Jews the same as us Germans because they are genetically different from us. Therefore, well, they must have different interests because they're not us. They're different because, it's from a racial, genetic perspective. There's a particular type of nationalism that emerged at this time called Völkisch nationalism. And this is the fundamental principle of it, is that the Germans constitute a biological entity and that's the basis on which the German nation exists. They were pretty much invariably anti-Semitic because the Jews are just different. They are a different nation, basically, because they're genetically different. So, therefore, they couldn't be included within it. There were different responses to this perceived issue with the Jews, which was that, you had this one nationalist called Heinrich von Treitschke, and he basically thought, right, the only way this is going to work is basically if the Jews become German. So they really should just completely abandon, their Jewishness, like their Jewish identity, their religion, and so on, and, maybe convert to Christianity or something like that, and, fully become German. Because in this way, there's going to be no competition between the Germans and the Jews. It's going to be clear. This is Germany. It is for Germans. And if you're not German, you either go somewhere else or you become German yourself. This is the problem, though, for if you're looking at things from a Völkisch perspective. That's not possible. It is not possible to become a German. The idea is that you're born into it. You are born a German by virtue of your genetics. It's not something you can become. This then just created an insolvable problem. The presence of Jews, because they're not German, genetically speaking. And so you had men like Wilhelm Marr. Like, this guy coined the term anti-Semitism in 1879 for his own perspective. And he had a very pessimistic view of the situation, which was basically that the emancipation of the Jews in Germany, which by that point was unified into one country, this emancipation was caused like this existential conflict between the Jews and the Germans, and only one could one had to go. And as far as he was concerned at the time, the Jews were winning this perceived conflict. So that's why he coined this term anti-Semitism and formed the Anti-Semitic League to try and basically kick them out of Germany. That was the intention of the anti-Semites at this time. Just get rid of them. They don't belong here, because they're not genetically the same as us. That is the fundamental principle. So, ironically enough, there was also a particular Jewish thinker called Moses Hess, and he came to see things in actually quite a similar way. He came to, so unlike Marx, for example, who saw, history as the struggle between different classes, Hess saw history as a struggle between different races. But because he was Jewish, he advocated Zionism, basically, as a solution to this problem. He thought there was an issue with the Germans in particular, and he thought, yeah, they're never going to accept us, so we should try and form our own state in Palestine, and then the Zionist movement developed from when he was writing, which was, I think, a little bit earlier than some of the main Zionists. But to return to National Socialism, just to emphasize as well with the Folkish movement, this is more relevant to how I got into this type of thinking, because Germanic neo-paganism actually came out of the Folkish movement, as we know it today. I'm not sure a lot of neo-pagans actually know this or are aware of it, and if they are, it's probably something they would rather not think about too much, because essentially it does mean that this sort of modern spiritual movement, it has its roots in this like racist nationalism in Germany, basically. That's just the truth. Like, that's just where it comes from. The impetus to start, looking back to the pre-Christian gods of the Germanic world was in this context of Germans trying to define themselves as a nation. And at that time, in that context, a lot of people were doing it through the idea of race. They didn't understand genetics, obviously, the way that we do now, because they did not have the technology at the time to actually learn these things. So they made a lot of assumptions, which obviously today, seem ridiculous to us, but they didn't have much else to go on. They were just trying to figure things out. We can't blame them so much for some of the false conclusions that they came to. It's more this sense of existential struggle that I kind of think may not have been necessary. But of course, there were a lot of other people at the time that thought that as well. It's just these particular people that had this particular way of thinking that, thought, well, we need to get rid of the Jews. That's the only solution to this problem. There were other people, of course, that didn't think that was a problem. I mean, the important thing here about the Folkish movement is they saw like a link between the land and the folk. Now, that's something that I actually do. I call this land bond, and I think this is important. It's just, I think the difference is that I don't see the need to emphasize the racial aspect, but I can see why people would, because if people have a very long history of being in a particular land, and let's say they're even biologically adapted to it. I mean, I have fair skin. This is an adaptation that helps living in like a climate where there's less sunlight, like where I live. So there is something to the idea of like a mutual belonging in this sense of like a people and their land. It's just that I think that the Nazi way of looking at it is just quite rigid in that sense. It's pretty inflexible. Ironically enough, fascism is an ideology which is not completely interchangeable with National Socialism, but it's related. Fascism is a wee bit more flexible in how it defines the nation. I'm not a fascist, by the way, either, because that's... ironically enough, I think fascism is very explicitly statist, in the sense that it's about like a powerful state. National Socialism, I'm not sure is necessarily statist in the same way. It's more just, I think, about the maintaining the nation as like a biological entity. The interesting thing, though, about Völkisch nationalism is that this is actually considered a form of populism. So, again, this is how it differs from conservatism, because it sees the folk as one entity. And this is why they, the whole class thing, they don't like to consider that as much. They don't like the idea of class conflict. They don't like the idea of either, the sort of underclass, the proletariat or whatever, trying to, overthrow the ruling class, nor are they interested in necessarily maintaining the ruling class for its own sake. They might be interested in just sort of maintaining the status quo just to keep the nation together, which is an important difference. This is how Nazis can be more revolutionary in that sense. Their values, though, tend to be quite conservative or traditional, you might call it. And again, that's to do with seeing this connection between the land and the folk, which has a historical sort of tradition. It is looking to the past in that sense, sees a continuity between the past and the present, and wants to just continue this into the future. It's quite perennial, you could say, as opposed to something that's completely revolutionary, which is like, no, the past was bad, we don't want that, we want something totally new. National Socialism obviously isn't like that, but it is revolutionary, potentially, because it can challenge the status quo. If the status quo is perceived as being against the interests of the folk. So that's it for the definition and the context of National Socialism coming about. So now I want to get a little bit more into the actual history of National Socialism as a movement. So like political parties, the Nazi Party and so on. So the earliest political parties to call themselves National Socialist, so it's usually National Socialist German Workers' Party. I think the earliest one was called the Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, DAP, German Workers' Party. Earliest one was in Bohemia, which is now part of Czechia. And this was the Germans that lived, in Czechia within the Austro-Hungarian Empire as opposed to Germany. And they were formed by German tradesmen in opposition to the burgeoning nationalism of the Slavs, like the Czechs in particular. And the interesting thing about these guys, they weren't so strongly anti-Semitic. They were more anti-Slavic, because that was, I don't think actually there were that many Jews in Bohemia in that time and place. It was more the Czechs that they had an issue with, because they saw like burgeoning Czech nationalism as a threat to the interests of the Germans that lived in Bohemia. Now, at the same time that this was happening within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, German anti-Semites formed an organization called the Germanenorden, the Germanic Order, in 1911, 1912 sort of time. It was a secret society, and it was supposed to be a counter to, the perceived Jewish secret activities. And it did attract some of these Germanic neo-pagan occultist types. And they also were the first to use the swastika as an emblem, because, oh man, I really do want to talk about this kind of stuff, like the what's called Ariosophy, which is the sort of earliest type of Germanic neo-paganism coming out of the teachings of a man called Guido von List, who was Austrian. And yeah, these guys founded the Germanenorden. They were into that kind of thing. This organization split during the First World War, 1916, and the Munich branch was renamed the Thule Society in 1918. War was still going on at that point. More people might have heard of the Thule Society because that is where the German Workers' Party in Germany came from, which is the precursor to the Nazi Party. That's because there was this man called Anton Drexler in 1918, and the war ended. First World War ended. Germany lost, and a lot of Germans were pretty bitter about it because they'd basically been there was this whole thing about the fact they hadn't been defeated in battle so much as sort of outmaneuvered by the Allies. Because some of these people were anti-Semitic, they blamed Jews within Germany for sabotaging the war effort. It's called the stab in the back myth. So this guy, Anton Drexler, He's not a particularly prominent individual. He's just a locksmith in Munich, and he formed some sort of workers' circle and it was specifically, to talk about the issues that they perceived of, like Germany having been defeated and it being, the work of the Jews. And he was approached by a member of the Thule Society called Karl Hauer, a journalist for a right-wing newspaper. And Hauer convinced Drexler to form a new political party, so it's the German Workers' Party. Meanwhile, this is at pretty much the same time this was happening in the newly formed country of Czechoslovakia. A member of the DNSAP there wrote a book called National Socialism, Its Foundations, Its Development, and Its Goals. So he had these two kind of things, Rudolf Jung and his, National Socialism in Czechia, and the German Workers' Party in Germany, which I don't think at that point they necessarily had a name for their movement. Drexler wanted to call it socialist, but Hauer was like, no, don't call it socialist, you're going to scare the middle class. Now, of course, Adolf Hitler joined the German Workers' Party. He was actually commissioned by the German army to infiltrate the party because the army was kind of suspicious of it. They had just recently quelled an attempted communist revolution in Bavaria, so they were kind of suspicious of this workers' party that was some people would consider themselves socialist. But he ended up joining, and for some reason, I don't know the details as to why, but he was able to do that, even though soldiers were not technically allowed to join political parties. I'm not going to speculate. I don't know what was going on. All I'm going to do is just, go on a little bit about the history and the spiritual aspects of National Socialism once Hitler took control. He wanted to rename the DAP the Social Revolutionary Party, but he was actually convinced by Rudolf Jung to call it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, in German NSDAP. And so he decided to do that. Presumably that was to link, this German party with the Nazis in, Czechoslovakia and Austria. And you could say from that point the rest is history. I'm not going to go into the rest of that because that's all very quite well known history. It's well covered in other places. He replaced Drexler as the leader in 1921. So that's when he started on the road to becoming Germany's dictator. He learned to influence mass psychology through his rhetorical style and the use of theatrical techniques and aesthetics. Now, these aesthetics, this is more what I want to focus on. There are specific aspects of the Third Reich, which would be how it relates to spirituality and religion, because this was kind of the context for me getting into these kind of ideas. A lot of it is because of the fact that they drew on the Germanic pagan imagery, because of course it's just part of Germany's past. It's just seeing that continuity from the past into the present. At the same time though, with Hitler in particular, you really can't ignore the very sort of Greco-Roman aspect, which is more a feature of fascism. Obviously, fascism comes from Italy. The Romans came from Italy, so there's a natural connection there. For Italy, the Roman Empire is their kind of like connection to the past and so on. But Hitler thought this was important as well. It is interesting because on the one hand, he did share this idea that the Germanic, or the German race in particular, was superior to all other races. But in a historical sense, he actually preferred the civilizations of Greece and Rome to what the Germans were doing at the same time, because as far as he was concerned, they were just savages. They might have been racially pure or whatever, but the Greeks and the Romans were achieving things because they had civilization, and he liked that very much. And this is where it gets interesting, because this is where he actually clashed with Heinrich Himmler. Himmler was a lot more I don't want to say my kind of guy, because I just mean in terms of his just his particular interests. I don't think Hitler was that. He was much more practical. Like I said, he was much more into the ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome, and he saw modern day Germany as more parallel of that. Himmler was more into the ancient Germanic tribes kind of stuff, and he was more into his neo-paganism and occult kind of stuff. I have to say, though, that his spiritual worldview was quite different from, your average, you talk to any Germanic neo-pagan nowadays. They're usually kind of polytheistic in a way, because they're looking back to the religion of their ancestors. The kind of stuff that Himmler was drawing on was actually more the Ariosophy kind of stuff, and it was more occultism. And it was actually kind of more monotheistic as well, because that's just the kind of stuff that was emerging in the sort of 19th and early 20th century. There's two sources of this you can perceive in Himmler's thinking. One is the Oera Linda book, which he references terms from that book. That came in the 19th century, and that was it was supposedly like a reflection of like the purest Germanic spirituality. And also Karl Maria Willigut, who was his sort of spiritual mentor. And it was Willigut was pretty instrumental in designing the sort of rituals and regalia of the SS. The spirituality or theology in both the Oera Linda book and coming from Karl Maria Willigut was actually monotheistic. And very interestingly, both had this in common, that they perceived the type of spirituality that you would read about in, let's say, the Eddas. They actually saw that as a degeneration from a purer, higher form of spirituality. So, like, they seemed to have gone along with this idea that the Christians emphasized, which was that the pagan gods were originally just men, and they were deified because they did great and glorious things. Which there is something to that. There's ancestor worship. Yeah, there's a bit of a ambiguity between like ordinary people that did great things, and then after death they kind of become divine, sort of thing. Would want to emphasize, none of the leading Nazis within the Third Reich were really into what you would consider Germanic neo-paganism nowadays. Himmler was the closest. Again, it was this kind of weird, like, occultic, monotheistic spin on Germanic paganism. Initially, the Nazis tried to, once they got power, 1933, they tried to institute this thing called positive Christianity. The main theorist behind this was Alfred Rosenberg, and he wanted, because at that point, obviously, Germany was a majority Christian country, Hitler in particular really didn't want to, even though, the Thule Society is kind of the origins of the Nazi party and so on, he just was not interested in this kind of stuff, or at the very least didn't want to be associated with it. So this kind of thing was de-emphasized, and it was sort of acknowledged that most Germans were Christians. So, like, Hitler continued to present himself to the public as a fairly devout Catholic, even though that it has to be said, like, we know now that pretty much all the Nazis were anti-Christian. They saw Christian ideals and values as at odds with their own ideology. So in that sense, like, no, I don't think you can really consider the Nazis to have been Christian. You do get Christian Nazis nowadays. They're called Christian Identity, and it's a similar kind of thing as what Rosenberg was trying to promote. His idea specifically was that Jesus was an Aryan rather than a Jew, and that he got recast as a Jew, probably by Paul. So that was the kind of spin, but this just didn't work because it's bollocks anyway. I mean, and most people can see that. The only people that can't see that are Christian Identity people, and the way that they sort of rationalize their perspective is that they see Europeans, I think Germanic and Celtic people in particular, as being descended from the lost tribes of Israel, and the Jews are the descendants of Cain or something like that. But that doesn't fool too many people, and it didn't back in 1930s Germany, so the Nazis kind of had to try something else to sort of get past this issue with the fact that they were opposed to Christianity, but most Germans were Christian. And they came up with this expression of belief which is Gottgläubig, which is roughly translates to belief in God. Now, the Nazis were also pretty dismissive of atheism. I can't remember which ones might actually have been atheist, but I know Hitler and Himmler were both kind of like, they didn't like atheism. They thought it was most communists were atheist anyway, so that's just another thing that they wouldn't have wanted to have in common with them. But they did believe in God. They didn't believe in the teachings of Jesus because that's too pacifistic and not what they wanted. But yeah, and they weren't pagan either, because I suppose that just was a bit too eccentric, I suppose, from their perspective. They just wanted something to embody a very masculine ideal, and just the idea of like, yeah, I just believe in God without too many strings attached, too much tradition or ritual or anything like that. That's good enough, and that's kind of what they promoted. And so a certain percentage of Germans went along with that, but to be honest, like, most just stayed Christian, even in the SS. The Nazis at that time, like the Nazi Party, Hitler in particular, they really did want to get the hard political objectives down, and they weren't so concerned with remolding German society in their image. They were like, right, well, when we win the war, we'll do that. Spoiler, they lost the war, so they didn't manage to do that. But of course, you do have neo-Nazis today that still, to varying degrees, believe in this kind of message. And I suppose, like, where they actually succeeded in Germany wasn't so much with necessarily changing the religion of the country, but it was in mobilizing the German masses into a force that was capable of taking on Britain, France, and Russia again after having been defeated and then, forced to pay reparations and so on. And this was done through emphasizing the superiority of the German people and the belief in their destiny to rule the world as the master race. And that this would be achieved by destroying the power of the Jews, which they perceived as working through the liberals and the communists and the socialists in particular. So anything that wasn't really like, more traditional. I think this aspect's probably the most important because you've got to consider the context of the time. It was the early 30s. World was in the grip of depression, and Germany was hit harder, or probably hardest, because they were already paying reparations for having started the First World War. I'm not saying Germany did start the First World War. I'm saying that's what they had to pay reparations for. They had to take responsibility for starting the war. A lot of historians would think that the terms were too harsh and they were instrumental in the rise of the Nazis, and I would agree with them. Because Germans were, their situation was pretty bad. Look at their options. What did they have to choose between? They could choose between the more traditional liberal parties, and what would they have been able to do? Given the situation, I think they were the liberal parties might have just struggled to come up with new ideas for how to change or how to better things for Germany. Your other option was socialists and communists, which if you see that as a viable solution, then yeah, a lot of Germans did, because the Communist Party, they got a lot more votes at that time as well. But a lot of Germans just didn't like them either. So they went with the Nazis, because Hitler was just very persuasive. He was an excellent orator, and he was able to play on the Germans' hopes and fears. And like I said, these techniques that he used for the Nazis' political rallies and so on were quite revolutionary for the time. And once they did take power, they did start to improve the economy by gearing it for war. And it just kind of went from there. So yeah, I'm not going to comment either way on, I suppose, the situation of Germany at that time. Just that I would see it as just being a result of the First World War, basically. So anyway, with that, just a quick comment about some of the neo-Nazi spirituality that you have nowadays. In terms of how they relate to each other, this is probably the most controversial point that I would want to say, which is that I don't think that it is a contradiction to be both a Nazi and a Germanic neo-pagan. Now, I consider myself a Germanic neo-pagan, more or less. I don't, not exclusively. There are other traditions that I also feel quite a strong connection to that are not Germanic, but I don't consider myself a Nazi, or at least because I don't see things from like a racist perspective, or like seeing race as like the be all and end all of like human existence. I just don't support this kind of ideas anymore. But you do get people out there, the Germanic neo-pagans, and they're like, "Oh God, those Nazis! They really shouldn't be involved with what they're doing because we disapprove of what they're doing." But to be honest, National Socialism is more like incompatible with Christianity, because Christianity is universalist. Anybody can be a Christian. Some people argue anybody can be a Germanic neo-pagan as well, but if we're being honest, the pagan traditions do tend to be expressions of particular cultures. Like I say, I'm not a folkish pagan or anything like that anymore. I tend to take a more flexible approach to this kind of thing. But let's say that you have somebody who's arguing that Germanic neo-paganism should only be for white people. Now, I don't agree with this idea, but it's not logically inconsistent. If the idea is that the Germanic spirituality is an expression of that particular ethnic group, and that there's an ancestral aspect to it, that would be something that would be carried down through the family line, as it were. It's just that I would contest this personally, because I think there's more to it than that. I think that actually being born in a land where you might not be white, but you might be born into a country where you're surrounded by white people or Germanic people or what have you, or you could just like come into a community of Germanic neo-pagans and you might just find that you just vibe with them more than people of your own race. And just like, from my perspective, I don't see why you shouldn't, well, I don't see why you couldn't be included in the Germanic community. But that's my perspective, and that's what I believe. But I don't feel as if I can honestly say that the people who disagree with that and say it only makes sense that you would be white and practice Germanic neo-paganism, it's like I cannot say that they are logically wrong in their argument either. I don't know if that's might be a bit confusing, but these kind of topics are not cut and dry because they do deal with personal beliefs and subjective realities and this sort of thing. And the only other thing that I'll say though is that from my own experience, even though I would say that Germanic neo-paganism is not necessarily incompatible with National Socialism, I do think that when you meld the two together, you can get some pretty strange types of spirituality coming out of that. And probably the best example of that would be that of the Chilean diplomat called Miguel Serrano. And he is basically the founder of something known as esoteric Hitlerism, which is a very interesting, very obscure movement that's apparently quite popular among members of the Azov Brigade in Ukraine, where they kind of see a connection between figures like Odin and Jesus and Hitler, all kind of similarly, and it's very Gnostic. I'd like to talk about Gnosticism at another point in more detail. Just to sum it up, the principle of Gnosticism is that the Jewish God in the Bible is sort of like an evil lesser god, and that the true God that Jesus taught about is beyond that being, and so on. And so, like, yeah, it ties into the anti-Semitism thing, because the thing with esoteric Hitlerism is it goes deeper than the racial aspect, because it also is anti-Jewish in a religious sense as well as anti-Semitic in a racial sense. I find Serrano's work very interesting, though. Like, there's something about his writing that I really like in the sense of he's able to. It might probably because he was a diplomat, uh, very good with words. Obviously, I'm reading English translations, but there's just something about the way he communicates and the type of concepts he get across. Like, he had I think, a pretty good understanding of esoterica. You know, like these kind of concepts, the alchemy, esoteric alchemy kind of stuff. He's a lot easier to understand than someone like Julius Evola, who's quite verbose and kind of complex in comparison. His work is more difficult to read, in translation at least. So those are my thoughts on National Socialism. I am not a fan, but I find it's worthwhile to talk about because, well, I don't know to what extent these kind of ideas are becoming more popular. They're certainly becoming more available through the internet, as it were. I would say, though, that if you do not want these kind of ideas to spread, you should not oppose them too vigorously, because I have found in my experience that it simply feeds into the sense of indignation and also victimhood on the part of people that believe such things. So if you go after Nazis and so on, and you come at them with almost like an extermination, well, because it's ideological and not racial, you know, you don't necessarily want them dead, but you at least want them to think a different way. But if you're going at it a bit too hard, they're just going to double down and probably even get even more radical about it. So just for all of the anti-fascists out there, yeah, I think what a lot of you doing is counterproductive, to be quite honest. As somebody who would like to see less Nazism around, I don't think you're helping. I'll just say that for the last part. I hope you find this interesting. Thank you very much for watching, and I will speak to you again at some other point. Thank you.